Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking about intuition, how to identify it, develop it, and apply it. Our guest is Helen Palmer, director of the Center for Investigation and Training of Intuition. Helen Palmer's academic training is in psychology. She's on the faculty at John F. Kennedy University and taught at Antioch University West in San Francisco. She is a practicing clairvoyant. What does that mean to be a practicing clairvoyant?
Well, clairvoyance is a difficult thing to describe unless you have an experience of it. It's an aspect of intuition, a particular inner ability. And even though I gave 2 sessions earlier today that depended on my intuition, my clairvoyance, it's still difficult to describe. It can be described best, I think, by its operation, by what it's good for, the results it can have. Clairvoyance is defined as an inner seeing, an ability to see, literally, impressions that are very similar to dream impressions. And they can be induced voluntarily in certain states of mind. And they're capable of conveying a quality and a kind of information that's not available to the thinking self. And it's a capacity that, theoretically, anyone who has ever experienced and remembered their own dream has access to. Very often in a dream state, we have all of the prototype of what is necessary to access clairvoyance. In a dream, the thoughts go to sleep, so to speak, or attention is removed from thoughts. We go to sleep, we go empty. And then in the absence of direction by the thinking self, a dream appears, a set of impressions, visual impressions. And then as attention returns to the thinking self, we wake up in the morning, we remember what appeared to us, what was remembered by us in the absence of direction by our own thoughts. So a clairvoyant is someone who has either by inclination, trained, or by birth has retained the ability since early childhood to be able to induce a voluntary dream. And often, as we know, in ordinary dreams, there is an information from a non-thinking and very conscious part of ourself that makes available its information to the thinking part of the self through the mechanism of the dream. We understand something about our inner process, our internal process, that we couldn't have obtained through thought, but we obtained it through this vehicle of our own dream, our own visualization. And often this information is fundamental to our life and gives guidance from a part of ourself that we're essentially out of touch with. The thinking self is out of touch with this vital source of information within us. Sometimes we even have a precognitive dream, which is much closer to a real understanding of clairvoyance. In a precognitive dream, the thoughts go to sleep, attention is removed from thoughts, and the dream happens that has a kind of information in it that when we wake up we may not fully understand, but subsequently the event is played out, and then we remember, I dreamed this prior to the experience being played out in my everyday life. We recognized it as having had prior information before the event was played out. That's a clear example of clairvoyance. And in many cultures, that's a cultivated ability. People learn to dream voluntarily as a source of information, not only about their own forgotten self, but about events that are not accessible to the thinking self.
How do you apply, when we say a practicing clairvoyant, how do you apply that ability to see, to close off the conscious part of your mind and see things with the other parts of your mind?
Well, the application is a different question than what it is, and I apply it in the way that is most appropriate in my own life. I was a trained psychologist, and I was used to working with people therapeutically, like in a one-to-one counseling situation. And then through a series of life events and a great deal of inner life practice, spiritual practices and meditational practice, this clairvoyant capacity became differentiated from the rest of my thoughts, from my thinking self. And so I apply it in the way that seemed most natural to me. I started to do sessions for individuals based on my newly emerging clairvoyance rather than on my past training as a psychologist. So essentially, it's exactly the same setup, but the deal is slightly different. The setup being that a client, a person, will come with the questions that they would essentially address to a counselor or a good friend. And those questions come from their life. Their life situations are usually family, relationships, many questions about completions of projects, work, meditation, sexuality, those kinds of issues. And so the question is asked, and instead of facilitating the client's insight as I would as a therapist. Instead, I close my eyes and I shift my attention from my thoughts to a state of mind that is absent of my own thinking, where visual impressions with respect to those questions appear to me as in a dream, and then I will relate what I have perceived to the client. So it's a different kind of way of working with people based on a state of mind that I never recognized was available to me until I was well-formed and an adult with my habits already formed. So I use it as my habits direct me.
How then would we define intuition? Is it separate and apart from clairvoyance?
Again, intuition is more easily described by what it is not. It's more like an operational definition of what it can do. It is not an intellectual process. Intellectual thinking has to do with known information and a deductive conclusion based on that known information. Intuition is something else. Intuition is addressed to those same issues that the intellect is preoccupied with. It's used to derive information of a kind. But it is not intellectual in its nature, although it may have information that can be then used intellectually. Clairvoyance is an aspect of intuition. It's a way of sensing information visually. There are many kinds of internal capacities, some of which I am more conversant with than others. Sometimes I work with somebody who has developed a form of intuition, often unrecognized to themselves, and sometimes of a very high order, that is so original in the way that they perceive particular information that is vital to their emotional or their survival in the world, their emotional or other kinds of survival in the world. They're entirely sensitive to these issues and yet are unaware of the nature of their own, the source of their own information or how they're picking up this information. So I just do the obvious, which is to alert them to what they are already doing. But the classical kinds of ways of receiving information intuitively are voyance, to see, as in a dream, clairvoyance, clear view, or clear sense, clairsentience, which is nominally thought of as maybe the gut reaction, like the impression that precedes thought. One knows emotionally before one knows cognitively. It's a way of perceiving information first through inner perception, and secondarily we wire it through our thinking process and come to some sort of conclusion.
Normally when we use the word intuition and we think about it, we think of something that some people have and some people don't. And yet when we talk about the Center for the Training of Intuition and the investigation and training of intuition, you're suggesting that everybody has a little bit and you can make more of what you have than
Yes.
what you have before?
See, historically, we're so involved in our culture, at any rate, in the Western cultures, we're so involved with the intellect that somehow the idea of somebody who has managed to preserve and still be aware of, consciously have conscious access to their intuition, sticks out, as an amazing creature. In other cultures, intuition is taken for granted. It's something that is identified and trained, so to speak, by the family and by the culture. In our language, it's easier for me in the Western language to talk about discovering something. And any capacity, once you identify its workings, it's usually unrecognized workings, which may be full-blown but unrecognized, then you can develop a series of practices to make it more recognizable to the thinking self. So training in this sense doesn't mean that a new ability is found and unearthed. It means that we recognize the already existing pattern of how we perceive intuitively. Usually that in and of itself is a great discovery. Nothing new really has been added. No new discovery about a new perception all of a sudden opens like one morning awaking and seeing purple. That's not what clairvoyance is. It's to recognize the already existing times when the attention is shifted to the state of mind where one can perceive in the absence of thought, where impressions appear, but the thinking self is not aware that it is receiving such impressions. So what you're trying to do is to recognize an already existing ability, set of abilities, how they're focused, what issues we're sensitive to. What kinds of material we tend to be preoccupied with would be the kinds of issues that we pick up psychically, are sensitive to. Once you recognize that you're doing it, of course you can improve it with practice. That's just self-evident.
Are there some people in this Western culture that have burned out their capacity for intuition by being totally logical, rational, intellectual beings?
Like It's like any human ability. If you practice one, you're going to leave others in detriment. If somebody becomes a very brilliant violin player, they're unlikely to know much about the tuba. But aren't they both musical instruments? Do you see? Yeah, one is highly facile with one and doesn't really recognize the other. So certainly, if you emphasize the intellect, the direct access to intuition may be left aside. However, in the practice of any intellectual pursuit, my suspicion is that intuition, if it is present, is actively being practiced at the same time in order to make that person more successful. For example, if you line up 10 people of equal training and equal intelligence, you see, and they were all relatively emotionally stable, and some are far and away more creative than others, there's some factor that is present and available to those few that are outstanding than is available to the general population of similars. So what makes those few more capable? You see, when you investigate further, you realize that they do operate through being able to risk and move into a state of mind where there is not yet a known conclusion. Okay? And that kind of, you might call it a risk. It's like, well, I really don't know the answer, but I'm just going to keep my attention focused on the data that I have present until some inspiration hits. You see, now I don't think of that as an untrainable ability. First you have to notice what you're doing, how your attention operates, break it down into some form of recognizable pattern, and then amplify its abilities. Retrain yourself to recognize them consciously. And then some very interesting things can happen. For example, most people are very highly psychic or highly intuitive with respect to those issues that have been preoccupying them from childhood. And to go further, if you want to investigate finding your own intuition, you really have to look no further than to try and look at strangers on a street and to notice what does your attention try to pick out in stranger after stranger after stranger. What are you preoccupied with? For some, it would be some form of attention or love. For some, it would be some way of preventing being overwhelmed. For some, it might be how to perform and have good standing in the eyes of others. For some, it might be something like how to take control of the situation. For some, it might be like how to best be left alone, to remain as far away from contact as possible. There are only a certain finite number of real preoccupations that stem from early childhood conditions. So when you recognize what your attention is preoccupied with, the next stage in recognizing your intuition is to figure out, well, how did you get the information? You see, we take it so for granted that when we move into a new situation or we're looking at strangers on a street, that everybody is looking for the same piece of information. Of course, they are not. When you recognize that you're looking for a different kind of information from people, the question then arrives, well, how do you operate from that information if nobody told you that they're going to overwhelm you or put you out of control, or that you will or will not stand well in their eyes, or that you can perform according to their expectations? And yet we operate from these kinds of informations as if they're given.
Is that a downside? Is that a danger with it? Does an individual who goes into a crowd and sees those things, what if you're not accurate? What if your gut reaction is wrong and you avoid someone based on something that's a bad guess? It's
both an ability and a liability. But if you would look in your own childhood, Charlie, to make it more personal,
okay,
you might look in your own childhood and be concerned as to what preoccupied you as a youngster. And for thousands and thousands of experiences, you would walk into the same living room with the same family constellation around you with that same preoccupation. So you'd become entirely used to operating off small cues, both physical, certainly to the five senses.
Mm-hmm.
And if that failed, in order to cut your losses emotionally, you would also exercise other kinds of perceptions, anything to cut our losses, so to speak, as a child, or to maximize our gains. So we'll do anything really as kids to alter, to get approval and attention, and to cut disapproval and being rejected. So we get entirely sensitive to small cues that are held up to us in childhood by this repeating parental situation. Okay, then we get hypnotized by it. It becomes a liability. Insofar as a child, for example, who could get love or approval would be altogether used to sitting down next to somebody and knowing how to please. Now, they might sell themselves down the river. They might so forget their own purpose and staying on course of their own life that they'll sell themselves out to get that reaction, that pleasurable reaction that somebody loves them. You see, so it can be a liability, but that doesn't say it's not intuitive. It may be highly intuitive, but it also may be a big, trouble in your life. On the other hand, in any situation, that person would certainly have an edge in being able to be liked in any given situation, because they would know when they are getting a proper reception, they would react to that.
Where does it come from, intuition? Can you isolate an area of the brain that it comes from?
You can only isolate your experience. I mean, science changes its point of view, which doesn't say that the present point of view is inaccurate or that the past 20 years were inaccurate, but every 20 years or so a new theory emerges based on new information. So as far as where it comes from, fortunately, that's not my problem. All I have to do is to produce phenomena and let somebody else consider the importance of the research task. My husband is a researcher, he's a scientist, and it's been a very interesting relationship. He more or less saying, okay, Helen, where's your evidence? And me more or less saying, okay, here's the evidence, you go find out where it comes from. But my job is as my interest and my job is as a practitioner. And so I can tell you phenomenologically, in my experience, how it comes. The part of the brain that I am most conversant with is the visualization center. This might be called in mysticism the third eye, the inner eye of imagination, of reverie, but not imagination in the sense of fantasy or projection. Imagination of a very highly focused kind that can be addressed specifically for certain questions to situations that are unknown to the thinking self. So for me, when you say, what is your form of intuition, I would say clairvoyance. And how do you perceive? I see.
There is a difference, I presume, between a thought and an intuitional flash. How does it translate? Is there some series of steps that it goes through? Because in order to act on intuition, oftentimes we have to translate it to a thought, don't we?
Yes, and you see that process goes on all the time. When you start to enter meditational life, the first level that you have to get to is to get beyond the barrier of thoughts. And that means literally to be able to practice a state of mind where you disengage from the thoughts. So you close your eyes, and what you usually come in contact with as soon as you close your eyes are thoughts of several kinds: memories, plans, fantasies, which are all belonging to the self. That's what you encounter mentally. So the practice would be to notice those thoughts or those memories and to remove attention back to some repeating, fixed point of preoccupation that you can refer your attention back to, like a mantra or a visualization or observing your breath or some internal repeating function that serves as a kind of a pillar so that you can tell the difference between your thoughts and your spiritual practice, your mantra or your breath watching or whatever practice you've adopted. So that's the first encounter when you move into the mind. Certain people experience less interference from their thoughts and more from their emotions. They close their eyes and go into inner state, and they start to have reactions, either of elation or of sadness. So the practice is the same. You adopt a focal point like a mantra or a visualization or observing the breath, a repeating function, and you systematically remove your attention from the emotions and apply or return your attention back to this spiritual practice. So as you move through learning to distinguish between breath watching and thoughts or breath watching and emotions, you see, you can begin to tell the difference. This is called discrimination practice. You can begin to tell because it's slowed down and you're observing at all times. You notice the difference between thinking state and other states of mind. That's what a spiritual practice is. It removes attention from thoughts and habits like emotions. Eventually, you can stabilize your attention, which is the underlined word in the inner life, attention. You can stabilize your attention in an empty state for a prolonged period of time. That's where it gets interesting. When you can stabilize your attention in an empty state, you can begin to give further discrimination between impressions that are projected from the self, where a thought is present, which directs an image, such as a guided image. What we would call a guided image and what in old spiritual practice would be called a category of the self called fantasy. So for example, if I sit here and I think beach scene, and then I imagine a beach scene with a bunch of guys in swimsuits and a few waves and sand dunes, then I'm involved in a guided image. I made it up. This is a different state of mind from being able to close your eyes and remove attention because of practice, 3 years of practice, remove attention from thoughts, and be able to enter a state of mind where the visions or the impressions precede thought, where impression with respect to a single outside situation precedes your thoughts about that situation. Then, of course, your thoughts come back to give voice and articulate what you have observed. But the sequence in a clairvoyant reading is to remove attention from thoughts, to remain empty, to focus the attention with respect to a single outside situation, a name of a person, a situation that you're directed to, a particular project, something like that, and to receive the impressions that appear in the absence of thought, that are not guided or directed from thought, and then come back to the thinking self enough to give a few simple words or phrases that indicate what you have seen.
In many life situations in which intuition would be very valuable, there isn't a whole lot of time to empty your mind, to go into a meditative state, to really be able to draw on that. You have to make split decisions.
Yes.
You're a baseball player and there's a pitcher on the mound and he's going to throw a fastball or a curve, and you're not too good on curves, and so you're really waiting on the fastball.
And if you're a good baseball player, you see, you would be acting not instinctively but intuitively within the confines of that game. And you would be not thinking a bit of it at all, but you would be operating on other impressions that are prolific in a tight situation like that, in a stress situation. But you would not have voluntary access to your intuition outside of that narrow situation. For example, your baseball player may be flagrantly psychic on the mound, but may be entirely unaware of any access to intuition whatsoever in the rest of that guy's life.
Mm-hmm.
What we're talking about now is trying to isolate how, if he is intuitive, if he is able to operate without thought and simply respond accurately in that situation from other impressions. You see, and again, this is where an intuitive would stand out over another equally trained physical gymnastic type of player. But what we're talking about now is voluntary intuition, which is to find access to that state of mind and be able to apply it into other situations.
You've talked about other cultures, the Western cultures being very intellectual, rational, all the other words that are thrown into it, and very conscious. But there are other cultures on the planet where people are more naturally intuitive, where it is more taken for granted in everyday part of life. They use intuition like we use the telephone.
They're not heavily addicted to thinking either. And that doesn't say that that is a less efficient culture in its way.
What would be an
ours.
example, and what would be a life situation from one of those cultures? How might they use intuition in a way that we wouldn't think
for survival purposes. The largest psychic traditions, at least that I'm aware of, were developed for survival of the people. For example, the Kahuna culture is very interested in navigation over long distances in the absence of compass or other kinds of instrumentation. That's not a heavy prerequisite living in the middle of Berkeley, California, but that's an important prerequisite. The Tibetans are extremely interested in developing long-range communication. They're up against cold and distance, you see, mountain ranges and difficulty in travel, so they're interested in another kind of communication. So the practices are very specifically developed along the lines of what is culturally necessary to different groups of people. There's some wonderful books by Lawrence Vanderpost in which he describes the qualities of the heart of the Bushmen of the Kalahari, which are desert people, nomads, and he describes one that I've always remembered because I read it right at the beginning of my whole excursion into the inner life. It's always stayed as an important memory, that he was traveling with a Bushman as a guide, and the Bushman said, well, let's hang around for a while. My family's going to come soon. I want to meet my family. And there they are out in the middle of the desert, sitting in a jeep. So there's no external indication, and sure enough, they camp, and a couple of days later, this little family walks out of the desert. And he felt it in his heart. The Bushman knew from the sign in his heart, or the feeling in his heart, that his family was near. So that kind of sensing, or inner sight, you see, is it's necessary in situations like that. I also know that those such treasures, such valuable qualities of humankind, where we exchange information of all kinds on an ordinary basis, that those exchanges exist, but the thinking self blocks out those communications. It's not that they're not available to us. It's that we are preoccupied with our attention located in a certain small section of our mind, which is called thinking brain. So we're located like on one telephone when all the rest of them are ringing. You see, and yet it's hard to put down the telephone you're good at, you know. It's a good conversation. The intellect chatters in a very compelling way. So we don't really want to put that down to spend the time or the effort to open up these other possibilities. However, if it's valuable enough or necessary enough in an intellectual's life, of course we will do the practices to get access to a state of mind that we need. When it becomes survival for me, then I will do those practices to keep myself alive.
Let's see if we can, in the last couple of minutes, lead our listeners through an exercise that will help them answer some of those ringing phones.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is to not push yourself unless you have a motive. And for many, curiosity is motive enough. I always have the feeling, you know, some people are inspired by their own curiosity or by an example of someone that they've seen that has access to inner abilities. But most of us, including myself, are kind of pushed from behind, you see. We need to cope in some way. We need to have some source of information that we just don't have, you see. And we need it because we're desperate about something. So that's the usual situation. So the important thing is to, when you're in a situation like that, to realize that you have resources that are not only your intellect. You don't have to just think your way out, but that you can shut your eyes and try to remove your attention systematically from the thoughts in order to be able to place a firm point of concentration on your dilemma that is not thinking and is not emotional. You see, and if you pose it to yourself as an issue of curiosity or an issue of when I need it, then I'll go there, you see, then there is enough curiosity aroused that you'll take the time to do it. But the important thing is to remove the attention from thoughts and from habitual reactions and to place your attention on this very self-same issue that the thoughts or the emotions might be highly focused on. But you're going to receive information from another source about those self-same issues.
How is that different from the traditional view of trusting in God and praying to God that things are going to be worked out?
Well, you see, when you pray to an external source, you are placing your attention on the very best that you can do within that situation. You're elevating yourself to that point of attention that is God. It's the highest you can go, so to speak, the most you're capable of. That really doesn't develop insight or information in the sense that we're talking about it. It kind of places it on God's responsibility. You see, if God wants to speak, well, then God, he or she will speak to me. But if we're speaking about intuition, we're talking about a human activity, something that very ordinary people like yourself and myself can develop. And we're talking about something that allows us to be more effective in the world. It's not placing it on a higher source's shoulders. It's placing it on our own shoulders, that we have these capacities and that we can access them and develop them within ourselves. So it's not really just saying, I hope things get better. And I hope it with the highest part of myself. I pray to God. It's more like I'm going to put my attention into my dilemma and I'm going to access information so that I can act. It's just a different perspective. But it is certainly outside of the self. In that sense, it is spiritual. The self being one's own thoughts and one's own habits. We want the source of information that is outside of the self.
Is intuition growing in the United States?
No,
in the Bay Area?
It's the same as it's always been, and people are just more interested in it. It's absurd. We think we've discovered something new. It's been around for millennia.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.